The wind screamed across the Coruscant Highlands at 22 knots, gusting to 31, carrying ice crystals that cut like glass shrapnel against exposed skin. At 14,000 feet, the temperature had plummeted to negative 14 degrees Celsius, and the blizzard that had rolled in 3 hours earlier showed no signs of breaking. Staff Sergeant Derek Holloway pressed his back against a frozen boulder and tried to steady his breathing. His lungs burned with every inhale, the thin air providing barely enough oxygen to keep his muscles from cramping. 50 meters behind him, his five-man element huddled in shallow depression, their white over gray winter camouflage making them nearly invisible against the snow-covered terrain. Nearly invisible, but not invisible enough. Holloway raised his Steiner M830 or LR binoculars and swept the ridgeline ahead. The extraction point was 800 meters to the northeast, a flat stretch of terrain where Phoenix, their Kiara helicopter, was supposed to touch down in exactly 15 minutes. Between his team and that landing zone sat the single most perfect kill zone he had ever seen. The valley funneled down to a natural choke point, maybe 40 meters wide, with sheer granite walls rising on both sides. Anyone moving through that gap would be exposed for approximately 90 seconds with zero cover. And Derek Holloway had been doing this long enough to know what that meant. He keyed his radio. Raptor 6. This is Overlook. Do you copy? Over. Static. Nothing but a howl of wind and interference patterns that made his earpiece crackle like burning paper. Raptor 6. Overlook. Emergency traffic. Requesting immediate acknowledgement. Over. More static. The blizzard had killed their long-range communications 40 minutes ago, right around the same time that Petty Officer Second Class Kowalski had stepped on a loose rock and tumbled 6 meters down an icy slope, shattering his left tibia and fibula on impact. Now Kowalski was being carried on a hasty litter by two of Holloway's men, his legs splinted with Sam splint and wrapped in an emergency blanket, and 4 line running lactated ringers into his arm to combat the shock that was slowly turning his lips blue. They couldn't go back. The route behind them was impassable now, choked with fresh snow and unstabilized formations. They couldn't stay. Kowalski would be dead from hypothermia in less than 2 hours, maybe sooner if the shock took him first. They had to go forward, straight into what Holloway was now certain was an L-shaped ambush. He lowered the binoculars and studied the terrain with his naked eye, trying to see what his gut already knew. There, movement on the eastern ridge, barely perceptible, the subtle shift of something that shouldn't be shifting. And there, on the western approach, the glint of metal that appeared for a fraction of a second before vanishing. Snipers. At least 2, possibly more. They were waiting. Holloway felt his stomach drop, a sensation he hadn't experienced since his first deployment 15 years ago. He had walked his men into a trap, and now there was no way out. If that opening hooked you, stay with me. This story only gets more intense. Subscribe now for more real stories of courage, and hit that notification bell. Drop a comment, and tell me where you're listening from. Now, let me take you back to where it all began, to another pair of eyes watching this valley from a position no one knew existed. 1,100 meters above the kill zone, buried so deep in the snow and rock that she had become part of the mountain itself, Elena Vasquez lay motionless inside her ghillie hide. She had been in this position for 11 hours. She had been watching this valley for 3 days. Her custom bolt-action rifle, chambered in .338 Lapua Magnum with a 27-inch barrel, and Schmidt and Bender PM25-25x56 scope, rested on a bipod she had carved herself from aircraft-grade aluminum. The weapon was cold. She was cold. Everything in the world had turned to ice. But her mind was fire. Through the scope, she watched the American team hunker down behind their boulder, watched their team leader skin the ridgeline with binoculars that wouldn't show him what he needed to see. She had already cataloged the enemy positions. 2 snipers on the eastern ridge at approximately 2,100 meters from her position, one on the western approach at 1,800, and a spotter with Dragunov SVD at 1,500 meters, coordinating the ambush from a concealed position behind a granite outcropping. 4 shooters, 6 Americans, 1 broken leg, 1 extraction helicopter that would never land if those snipers opened fire. Elena did the math in her head, the same way she had done 1,000 times before, the same way Colonel Marcus Hartwell had taught her before he betrayed everything she believed in. Wind, 22 knots sustained, gusting to 31. Temperature, -14 Celsius. Altitude, 14,000 feet. Air density, approximately 0.87 kilograms per cubic meter. Coriolis effect at this latitude, negligible but present. Bullet drop at 2,100 meters with her custom load, approximately 47 meters. Time window, 15 to 20 minutes before that helicopter arrived. If the snipers were still alive when it came, they would shoot it down. If the Americans tried to run, they would die in the kill zone. 15 minutes. 4 targets. 3 of them beyond 2,000 meters. Impossible shots. Elena Vasquez exhaled slowly, watching her breath crystallize and drift away in the wind. She had made impossible shots before. 3 years ago. In a life that now felt like someone else's memory, Elena Vasquez had been one of the most decorated Special Operations snipers in the Joint Special Operations Command. Her official record listed 17 confirmed kills across 4 deployments in Afghanistan and Iraq, and locations that didn't officially exist. Her unofficial record, the one that lived only in the classified files at Fort Bragg, told a different story. 43, that was the real number. 43 men who had looked through her crosshairs and never looked at anything again. She had been proud of that number once. She had believed, with the simple faith of a soldier who trusts her chain of command, that every trigger pull had served a purpose greater than herself, that the men she killed were enemies of everything she had sworn to protect. Then came Operation Crimson Threshold. Colonel Marcus Hartwell had recruited her personally for the mission, pulling her out of her regular unit and attaching her to a black ops team that didn't appear in any official documentation. The target was a compound in the Hindu Kush, supposedly housing a high-value Taliban commander responsible for planning attacks on American forward operating bases. Elena had taken position on a mountain ridge 2,000 meters from the compound, just as she was doing now. She had waited in her hide for 16 hours, watching patterns, counting guards, calculating winds that shifted like living things. When the assault team went in, she had provided overwatch, dropping 3 sentries in quick succession. The compound fell in under 4 minutes. The team extracted their target, a man in a black hood, and disappeared into the night. It was only later, 3 weeks later, that Elena learned the truth. The target hadn't been a Taliban commander. He had been an Afghan provincial governor who had been cooperating with American intelligence, providing information about poppy trafficking routes that implicated certain powerful people in the Afghan government, people who had connections to American military contractors, people who wanted him silenced. Colonel Hartwell had used Elena and her team to carry out an assassination, a murder, and when Elena had confronted him, demanding answers, he had smiled that cold reptilian smile and told her the truth. This is the real war, Sergeant Vasquez, the one that doesn't make the news. You can either be a player or a pawn. I thought you were smart enough to be a player. Elena had refused. She had filed reports through every channel she could access, trying to expose what Hartwell had done. But the reports disappeared. The witnesses were reassigned. The evidence evaporated. And then her team started dying. Sergeant First Class Michael Torres, killed in a training accident at Fort Campbell, crushed beneath an overturned Humvee during what should have been a routine convoy exercise. Staff Sergeant David Kim, shot by an unidentified insurgent during a patrol in Kandahar. The shooter was never found. Warrant Officer Rebecca Chun. Helicopter crash in the mountains of eastern Afghanistan. No survivors recovered. 3 names, 3 friends, 3 murders disguised as accidents. Elena understood the message. Hartwell was cleaning house, eliminating everyone who knew about Crimson Threshold, and she was next on the list. So she disappeared. The official record said that Sergeant First Class Elena Vasquez had gone AWOL during a leave rotation, likely suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder. Her security clearances were revoked. Her benefits were canceled. Her name was added to a list of military deserters that no one ever looked at twice. In reality, Elena had used every skill Hartwell had taught her to vanish into the shadows. She had spent 2 years hunting the men responsible for her friends' deaths, working her way up the chain of command until she reached a name that kept appearing in every file, every communication, every whispered conversation. Dmitry Belenko, Russian intelligence officer, arms dealer, puppet master, the man who had brokered the deal between Hartwell and the Afghan warlords, the man who had provided the intelligence that made Crimson Threshold possible. Elena had tracked Belenko across 3 continents, from Moscow to Istanbul to Karachi. The trail had led her here, to the Coruscant Highlands, where Belenko was rumored to be meeting with a new generation of clients. She had been watching the valley for 3 days, waiting for Belenko to appear. Instead, she had found this, an American Special Operations team walking into an ambush that would leave them all dead. Elena pressed her eye to the scope and watched Staff Sergeant Derek Holloway consult with his men. She didn't know his name. She didn't know any of their names, but she recognized the body language of a seasoned operator facing an impossible situation. The way his shoulders carried the weight of command, the way his hands moved with deliberate calm, even as his team's survival window shrank by the second. He was a good leader. That much was obvious. He had kept his people alive this long, kept them moving despite the cold and the terrain, and the wounded man they were carrying. But good leadership wasn't going to save him now. The enemy snipers were already in position. Their fields of fire overlapped perfectly, creating a crossfire that would shred anything moving through that valley. The Americans' only option was to retreat, but retreat was impossible with Kowalski on a litter. They were trapped. Elena's finger rested outside the trigger guard of her rifle, hovering in the space between observation and action. Her mission was Belenko. Every fiber of her professional discipline screamed at her to stay hidden, to let this play out, to preserve her position for the target that actually mattered. These men weren't a problem. She didn't know them. She owed them nothing. But as she watched Holloway turn back to his team, watched him begin formulating a plan that would lead 6 Americans to their deaths, Elena felt something she hadn't felt in years. Doubt. Staff Sergeant Derek Holloway gathered his team in the shallow depression, keeping his voice low even though the wind would have carried away any sound before it traveled 10 meters. The 5 men facing him were the best operators he had ever served with, and right now, every one of them knew they were in trouble. "Sitrep," Holloway said, "we've got at least 2, possibly 3 enemy snipers covering the extraction point. L-shaped ambush configuration, eastern and western ridge lines. They're dug in and waiting." Petty Officer First Class Marcus Webb, the team senior enlisted, spat into the snow. "Copy that. What's our play? Options are limited." Holloway glanced at Kowalski, who was semi-conscious on the litter, his breathing shallow and rapid. "We can't stay here. Polish is going into shock, and we'll all be hypothermic inside 2 hours. We can't go back. The route is compromised. That leaves forward, through the kill zone," said Chief Petty Officer Jonathan Reeves, the team's communications specialist who had been fighting with dead radios for the past 40 minutes. "Through the kill zone," Holloway confirmed. Silence. The wind filled the gap, howling through the rocks like something alive and hungry. Hospital corpsman 3rd Class Luis Ortega, who was monitoring Kowalski's vitals, looked up from his patient. "Staff Sergeant, I can maybe keep him stable for another 90 minutes. After that, his core temp is going to drop below 32 degrees, and we're looking at cardiac arrhythmia. He needs CaseVac now. Phoenix is inbound," Holloway said. "ETA 15 mics. If we can clear that extraction point, we get him out. And if we can't..." Holloway didn't answer. The answer was obvious to everyone. Petty Officer 3rd Class Anthony Chun, the youngest member of the team at 24, shifted his M4A1 and checked his magazine. What if we laid down suppressive fire? Pop smoke, sprint the gap, keep their heads down? Negative, Webb said. At this range, with this visibility, smoke's going to disperse in seconds. And suppressive fire against dug-in snipers at 2,000 plus meters? We'd be wasting rounds. We need our own overwatch, Reeves said. Someone to counter-snipe while we move. Every head turned toward the team's designated marksman, Petty Officer 2nd Class James Kowalski, currently lying on a litter with shattered leg and a 1,000-yard stare that said he was somewhere very far away. "Polish was our overwatch," Webb said quietly. Holloway closed his eyes for a moment, running scenarios in his head. Every option led to the same place. Casualties. His men dying in the snow while he watched, helpless. He thought about his wife, Maria, waiting for him at Virginia Beach. He thought about his daughter, Sophia, who would turn 6 next month and had made him promise to come home for her birthday party. He thought about the 15 years he had spent in the teams, the brothers he had lost along the way, the ones who would be waiting for him wherever sailors went when they died. He thought about leaving his men behind. Not an option. Not ever. Okay, Holloway said, opening his eyes. Here's what we're going to do. Webb, Chin, you're on point. You move fast. Use every piece of cover you can find. And you don't stop until you reach the LZ. Reeves, Ortega, you carry Polish. Stay low. Stay quiet. Wait for my signal. I'll bring up the rear and engage any targets that present themselves. That's suicide, Webb said flatly. You're making yourself the primary target while we run. I'm buying you time. Holloway's voice was calm, the voice of a man who had made peace with what was coming. Phoenix lands in 15 minutes. You get Polish on that bird. You get everyone else on that bird, and you go home. Derek, that's an order, Marcus. Webb's jaw tightened, but he nodded. 15 years of friendship, countless operations, and this was how it ended. Not with ceremony or speeches, but with a quiet order in a frozen valley half a world from home. On my mark, Holloway said, we move in 60 seconds. The team began final preparations, checking weapons, adjusting gear, saying the silent prayers that every soldier says when they know the odds have turned against them. Holloway watched them work, memorizing their faces, their movements, the sound of their breathing in the cold air. 1,100 meters above, Elena Vasquez watched the same scene through a Schmidt and Bender scope. She had adjusted her position slightly, bringing her rifle to bear on the eastern ridgeline where the two primary snipers were concealed. 2,100 meters. Wind at 22 knots, gusting to 31. Negative 14 degrees. She had made shots like this before, but never under these conditions. The cold was affecting the ballistics in ways that were difficult to calculate precisely. The wind was shifting constantly, requiring real-time adjustments that pushed the limits of human reaction time. And the altitude was thin, making every breath an effort, every movement sluggish. But the real problem wasn't the physics. The real problem was that taking these shots would compromise her position. It would reveal her presence to anyone watching, including Belenko's people, who were almost certainly in the area. It would end 3 years of careful planning, months of tracking, the chance to finally bring down the man who destroyed everything she cared about. One shot, and she would lose him forever. Elena's finger tightened on the trigger guard. The Americans were strangers. She didn't know them anything. But somewhere in the back of her mind, 3 names whispered to her. Michael, David, Rebecca, her people, her friends. The ones she had failed to protect. She couldn't save them. They were gone, buried in cemeteries she would never be able to visit, their graves marked with lies about how they died. But maybe she could save these 6. Maybe that would be enough. Elena calculated. It was what she did, what she had always done, ever since her father had first put a rifle in her hands on their family ranch in West Texas when she was 12 years old. She calculated windage and drop, distance and time, probability and consequence. The math said 2,100 meters with a crosswind gusting to 31 knots was a shot with less than a 40% success rate. The temperature was affecting her powder velocity. The altitude was thinning her bullet's coefficient of drag. The wind was a variable that could kill her, shifting directions every few seconds in the chaotic patterns that mountain storms created. But Elena had never been someone who lived by the math alone. She reached into her memory, pulling up every long-range shot she had ever made. The 1,800-meter engagement in Helmand province, where she had taken down a Taliban commander while his security detail scrambled. The 2,200-meter shot in the Panjshir Valley, where she had eliminated an enemy sniper who had pinned down an Army Ranger platoon for 6 hours. The impossible shot in Niger, 2,400 meters through a sandstorm, with visibility measured in meters rather than kilometers, that had earned her the Silver Star and a reputation that followed her everywhere. She knew what her body could do. She knew what her rifle could do. She knew the limits of physics, and she knew how to push beyond them. The real question wasn't whether she could make the shot. The real question was whether she was willing to give up everything she had worked for to make it. Elena watched the American team leader check his watch, counting down the seconds until he sent his men into a slaughter they couldn't survive. She watched his lips move, forming words she couldn't hear but could understand. Last orders. Final prayers. The rituals of men who knew they were about to die. And something inside her made a decision that her conscious mind hadn't authorized. She adjusted her scope, dialing in corrections she had calculated. She steadied her breathing, slowing her heart rate to less than 50 beats per minute, the rhythm she had learned after years of meditation and practice. She settled her crosshairs on the first target, the Eastern sniper who was positioned slightly higher than his partner, giving him a better field of fire, but also making him more exposed. 2,100 meters, 22 knots, gusting to 31. Elena exhaled half the air in her lungs and held the rest. Her world contracted to a single point of focus, a circle of clarity surrounded by infinite darkness. The wind became a number. The cold became a number. Everything that existed became math, and math was something she understood. Her finger moved to the trigger. Down in the valley, Holloway raised his hand, ready to give the signal that would send his men forward into death. Elena's finger began its slow, deliberate squeeze, and in that moment, suspended between heartbeats, she thought about Dmitry Belenko. She thought about vengeance, about justice, about the three names carved into her soul, like wounds that would never heal. She thought about everything she was sacrificing. Then she thought about the 6 men who were about to die for no reason at all. The rifle kicked against her shoulder. The sound reached the valley 2.4 seconds later. A distant crack that could have been thunder, could have been ice breaking somewhere on the mountain, could have been anything. The first sniper never knew what killed him. The .338 Lapua round struck him in the center mass, punching through his chest cavity and destroying his heart before his brain could register the impact. He collapsed into the snow, his Dragunov SVD falling from his hands, his eyes still tracking the Americans below who would never know how close they had come. Elena was already working the bolt, cycling the next round into the chamber, adjusting her aim before the first body had finished falling. The second sniper, positioned 4 meters from first, had approximately 1.2 seconds to process what had happened. He had heard the distant crack of the shot. He had seen his partner jerk and fall. His training kicked in, and he began to move, rolling toward cover that was never going to save him. Elena's second shot took him in the throat. The round entered just below his jaw and exited to the back of his skull, carrying fragments of bone and brain tissue into the snow behind him. He died with his hand reaching for his radio, the last signal of a man trying to warn comrades who were about to need all the warning they could get. 2 down, 2 to go. Elena cycled the bolt again, her movement smooth and mechanical despite the cold that had turned her fingers into wooden things that barely obeyed her commands. She swung her rifle toward the western ridgeline, searching for the third sniper. There, 1,800 meters, concealed behind a granite outcropping that provided excellent protection from the valley below, but left him exposed from her elevated position. He was already reacting, pulling back from his firing position, his head turning toward the eastern ridge where his comrades had just died. But he wasn't fast enough. Elena squeezed the trigger, and the bullet crossed 1,800 meters of frozen air in 1.8 seconds. It struck the sniper in the left shoulder, spinning him around and slamming him into the rock behind him. Not a kill shot. She had aimed for center mass, but the wind had gusted at the wrong moment, but it was enough. He was down, out of the fight, clutching a wound that would kill him slowly if no one came to help. 3 down. The spotter with the Dragunov was moving now, abandoning his position, and scrambling toward cover that would take him out of Elena's line of sight. He was good. She could see that immediately. Trained, professional, moving with the economical precision of someone who had done this before. But she was better. Elena tracked his movement, predicting where he would be in 1.3 seconds, leading her shot like a hunter tracking a running deer. The wind gusted again, and she adjusted without conscious thought, her body and rifle operating as a single system, calibrated by years of practice and thousands of rounds fired. The fourth shot caught him in the lower back, severing his spine, and dropping him face first into the snow. He would live, probably. The wound wasn't immediately fatal, but he wasn't going to be shooting anyone today. Elena lowered her rifle and allowed herself a single breath. 4 shots, 4 targets, 15 seconds. In the valley below, the Americans had frozen in confusion, their weapons raised toward threats that no longer existed. She could see the team leader, Holloway, though she didn't know his name, scanning the ridgelines with his binoculars, try to understand what had just happened. He would never see her. She was too far away, too well concealed, too much a part of the mountain itself. He would spend the rest of his life wondering who would save his team, and he would never find an answer. Elena began collecting her brass, policing the 4 shell casings that were the only evidence of her existence. She would leave nothing behind. No trace, no clue, no identity. Just a ghost on a mountain who had appeared long enough to change the fate of 6 men she would never meet. Staff Sergeant Derek Holloway's mind was racing, trying to process what had just happened. 3 seconds ago, he had been preparing to lead his men into a kill zone that would claim most of their lives. Now he was staring through his binoculars at the eastern ridge, where 2 enemy snipers had just been eliminated by someone he couldn't see. What the hell was that? Webb's voice was tight with adrenaline. Did you see where those shots came from? Negative. Holloway swept the terrain, searching for any sign of the shooter. Nothing. Whoever it is, they're invisible. Friendly sniper team? Chin asked. Maybe Delta or CAG running parallel ops? Nobody told us about any parallel ops. Holloway lowered his binoculars and made a decision. Doesn't matter. The LZ is clear, or at least clearer than it was. We move now while we still can. Copy that. The team assembled into movement formation with precision of men who had trained together for years. Webb and Chin took point, moving low and fast toward the valley entrance. Reeves and Ortega lifted Kowalski's litter, grunting under the weight as they began the treacherous descent. Holloway brought up the rear, his M4A1 scanning the ridgelines for any sign of additional threats. They moved fast, faster than caution would normally allow, but caution was a luxury they couldn't afford. Kowalski's breathing had become shallow and irregular, and Ortega was pumping his foot with warming fluid that wouldn't last much longer. Every second they delayed was a second closer to losing him. The kill zone loomed ahead, 40 meters of exposed terrain with no cover, no concealment, nothing but empty air and frozen ground. Phoenix, this is Overlook, Reeves called into his radio, even though he knew the blizzard was still blocking their comms. Phoenix, do you copy? Static. But underneath the static, something else, a faint flutter of a signal trying to break through. Say again, Phoenix. You're breaking up. Overlook, is Phoenix, ETA mics. The transmission dissolved into noise. They're coming, Reeves said. Phoenix is inbound. I think we got maybe 10 minutes. Then we make it in 9, Holloway said. Go. They entered the kill zone at a dead sprint, Ortega and Reeves carrying Kowalski's litter between them, Webb and Chin flanking wide to draw any fire away from the casualty. Holloway followed, his eyes tracking the ridgelines, waiting for the shot that would end everything. The shot didn't come. They were halfway through the gap, legs pumping, lungs burning in the thin air, when Holloway saw movement on the western ridge. A figure, one of the enemy snipers who had survived the mysterious attack, was dragging himself toward a rifle that lay in the snow 10 meters away. Contact west, Holloway shouted. Keep moving. He raised his M4 and fired a burst toward the ridge. But at this range, the shots were more suppression than aimed fire. The figure kept crawling, fingers clawing at the snow, reaching for the weapon that could still kill them all. 1,100 meters above, Elena Vasquez saw the same thing. The third sniper, the one she had wounded but not killed, was still in the fight. He was moving slowly, but he was moving, and if he reached that Dragunov, he could take out the Americans before they cleared the gap. She swung her rifle, calculated range and wind in an instant, and fired. The bullet struck the sniper's outstretched hand, destroying his fingers and sending the rifle spinning away into the rocks. He screamed. She could imagine the sound even if she couldn't hear it, and collapsed, cradling his ruined hand against his chest. Not a kill shot. Not necessary. Elena wasn't a murderer. She was a soldier, and soldiers made choices. She could have killed him easily, put a round through his skull, and ended the threat permanently. But he was no longer a danger to anyone. He would live, if his people found him in time. If not, well, that was war. In the valley, Holloway saw the enemy sniper fall, and didn't have time to wonder about the shot that had stopped him. He was running. They were all running. An extraction point was ahead, a flat stretch of snow that could accommodate a helicopter if one actually arrived. Phoenix, Overlook, we're at the LZ. Where are you? The radio crackled, and this time the voice came through clearly. Overlook, Phoenix is 90 seconds out. Pop smoke. Copy 90 seconds. Holloway pulled an M18 smoke grenade from his vest, yanked the pin, and hurled it into the center of the LZ. Purple smoke began billowing from the canister, a signal that would be visible from miles away. Purple smoke confirmed, Phoenix reported. We have eyes on. Coming in hot. The sound of rotors reached them seconds later, distant at first but growing rapidly, the heavy, rhythmic thump of an MH-60M Black Hawk cutting through the storm. The aircraft materialized out of the blizzard like a ghost, its rotors throwing up a tornado of snow that momentarily blinded everyone on the ground. Get him on board, Holloway shouted. Ortega and Reeves lifted Kowalski's litter and ran toward the open door of the helicopter. A flight medic in a helmet and flight suit was already reaching out, grabbing the litter rails and pulling the wounded man inside. Kowalski's eyes fluttered open briefly, registering confusion before sliding closed again. Everyone in. Go, go, go. Chun was next, then Webb, then Reeves. Ortega stayed with Kowalski, working with the flight medic to stabilize the injured SEAL. Holloway was the last man on the ground, his eyes still scanning the ridgelines as he backed toward the helicopter. Nothing moved. The enemy positions were silent, their occupants dead or dying in the snow. The mysterious shooter, whoever they were, had saved them all. Holloway climbed aboard and slammed his fist against the bulkhead. We're up. Get us out of here. The Black Hawk lifted off, its turbines screaming against the thin mountain air, and banked hard toward the southwest. Within seconds, the extraction point was lost in the swirling white of the blizzard, and the Coruscant Highlands disappeared beneath them. Derek Holloway leaned back against the vibrating bulkhead and closed his eyes. His heart was still pounding, his adrenaline still surging, but underneath it all was a profound sense of relief, and a question that would haunt him for years. Who had saved them? He had seen the shots, calculated the distances in his head, and the math didn't make sense. 2,100 meters through a gusting crosswind in negative 14-degree temperatures. That was an impossible shot. Multiple impossible shots. By someone they had never seen, would never identify, would never be able to thank. Webb, Holloway said, open his eyes. Yeah, boss. When we get back to Kandahar, I want a full debrief. Everything we saw, everything we heard. Someone was up there on that mountain, and I want to know who. Copy that. Webb's face was troubled, the face of a man who had just witnessed something he couldn't explain. You think it was one of ours? I don't know what it was. Holloway looked out the window at the white expanse below, already vanishing into distance and memory. But whoever they are, we owe them our lives. The flight to Kandahar took 47 minutes through turbulence that rattled the Black Hawk like a toy in a child's hand. Kowalski stabilized during the flight, his core temperature climbing back toward normal as the flight medic pumped warm saline into his veins and wrapped him in thermal blankets that looked like aluminum foil. He would lose 2 toes to frostbite. He would spend 8 months in physical therapy learning to walk without a limp, but he would live, and he would eventually return active duty. And years from now, he would tell his children about the time a ghost on a mountain saved his life. The debrief started 2 hours after they landed, in a secure room at the Joint Operations Center that smelled like stale coffee and fluorescent lighting. Holloway and his team sat around a scarred table, facing a lieutenant commander from Naval Special Warfare and a civilian analyst from the Defense Intelligence Agency who never gave his name. Let me make sure I understand, the lieutenant commander said, reviewing his notes. You're saying that 4 enemy snipers were neutralized by an unknown friendly asset during your extraction. Is that correct? That's correct, sir. Holloway's voice was flat with exhaustion. 4 shooters eliminated in approximately 15 seconds by what appeared to be a single sniper operating from an elevated position to our northeast. Estimated range? Based on the sound delay, at least 2,000 meters. Possibly more. The civilian analyst looked up from his laptop. And you're certain the shots came from a single source? I'm certain. The timing was too precise for multiple shooters, and the sound profile was consistent across all 4 engagements. Whoever this was, they're operating alone. Did you observe any muzzle flash, thermal signature, anything that would indicate the shooter's position? Holloway shook his head. Negative. Complete concealment. We searched the ridgelines with optics and saw nothing. What about the enemy combatants? Were any of them able to identify the shooter? Unknown, sir. By the time we extracted, Only one was still alive, the wounded spotter on the western ridge, and he wasn't in any condition to give a statement. The analyst typed something into his laptop, frowning at whatever appeared on his screen. We've been running analysis on the engagement site using satellite imagery. Weather conditions limited our coverage, but we managed to capture partial data during a brief break in the storm. He turned the laptop around, showing a grainy overhead image of the Coruscant Highlands. Red circles marked the enemy sniper positions. A yellow triangle marked what the analyst identified as a probable observation post 1,100 meters above the valley floor. This is a location that matches your description, analyst said. Elevated position northeast approach. Clear line of sight to all 4 engagement points. Based on the angle of bullet trajectories we reconstructed from the bodies, shots originated from somewhere in this zone. That's a 14,000-foot ridgeline, the lieutenant commander said. In a blizzard, how does someone even get to that position without being detected? With considerable planning and skill. The analyst's voice was carefully neutral. Whoever this was, they were watching the valley before your team arrived. 3 days of surveillance, minimum. They knew about the ambush before you did. Holloway leaned forward. Are you saying someone was running a parallel operation that we weren't briefed on? I'm saying we don't know. The analyst closed his laptop. We've contacted every SWF unit in theater, and none of them had assets in the Coruscant Highlands during your mission window. Delta, CAG, Rangers, Marine Raiders, everyone's accounted for. Whatever happened up there, it wasn't us. Then who was it? Silence. The question hung in the air, unanswered and unanswerable. We're opening an investigation, the lieutenant commander said finally. Codename Project Winter Ridge. We'll analyze the ballistics, review the satellite data, interview any witnesses we can find. If someone's operating in our AO without authorization, we need to know about it. And if they're not, Webb asked, if it's someone who just happened to be in the right place at the right time, then we owe them a debt. The lieutenant commander stood, signaling the end of the debrief. But until we know who they are and what they want, they remain an unknown entity. And in this business, unknowns can be dangerous. Holloway thought about the shots he had heard, the impossible accuracy, the clinical precision of someone who had killed 4 men in less time than it took to draw a breath. He thought about the enemy sniper crawling toward his rifle, stopped not by a kill shot, but by a round that destroyed his hand and nothing else. Dangerous, yes, but also restrained. Whoever was out there, they had made choices. They had killed when necessary and spared when possible. That wasn't the behavior of a random shooter or a rogue operative. That was the behavior of a soldier with principles. Sir, Holloway said as the lieutenant commander moved toward the door. Permission to speak freely? Go ahead. I don't know who that shooter was, and I don't know if we'll ever find out. But whoever they are, they saved my team. They gave us our lives back when we had no business surviving. If you find them, I'd like to know, not to bring them in, just to say thank you. The lieutenant commander nodded slowly. I'll keep that in mind, Staff Sergeant, but I wouldn't hold your breath. Some ghosts don't want to be found. He left, and the door closed behind him with a soft click that seemed to seal something. A mystery, a miracle, a moment that would never be fully understood. Webb looked at Holloway across the table. You think we'll ever know? Holloway shook his head. No, I don't think we will. 1,100 meters above the valley where 6 Americans had almost died, Elena Vasquez was erasing herself. She worked with methodical precision, the movements ingrained by years of training and repetition. First, the brass, 4 shell casings that she recovered and placed in a small pouch at her waist. She checked the snow around her position, smoothing away any impressions that might indicate where a rifle bipod had rested. Next, the hide itself. She had constructed it over the course of 2 nights, using local materials, snow, ice, rock fragments from the surrounding terrain, to create a concealment position that was virtually undetectable from even a few meters away. Now she dismantled it with the same care, redistributing the materials until the ridgeline looked exactly as it had before she arrived. Her ghillie suit went into a compression bag, followed by the thermal blanket that had kept her from freezing during the 11-hour wait. Her scope caps went back on the Schmidt and Bender, and the rifle itself went into a custom drag bag that could be carried on her back or cached if she needed to move fast. The entire process took 17 minutes. When she was done, There was nothing left to indicate that a human being had ever occupied this position. No brass, no equipment, no footprints. Just snow and rock and silence. Elena shouldered her pack and began the descent, moving south along a route she had scouted 3 days ago. The blizzard was beginning to ease, the wind dropping from 31 knots to something closer to 20, but visibility was still measured in dozens of meters rather than kilometers. She moved like a predator, each step deliberate and silent, her senses scanning the terrain for any sign of threat. The enemy fighters she had neutralized weren't the only hostile presence in these mountains. Belenko's network was vast, his surveillance extensive. If she had been careless, if any of her shots had been traced back to her position, there would be hunters looking for her even now. But Elena Vasquez had not survived 3 years of running by being careless. She thought about the Americans as she walked, replaying the engagement in her mind. The team leader, the one with the binoculars and the calm voice, had impressed her. He had been willing to sacrifice himself for his men, to draw fire while they escaped. That kind of leadership was rare, even in special operations. That kind of selflessness. She hoped he would make it home. She hoped they all would. But those weren't her thoughts to have. She had made her choice, taken her shots, and now she needed to disappear. Project Winter Ridge, whatever investigation the Americans launched, would find nothing. No witnesses, no evidence, no identity. Just a legend that would circulate through classified briefings for years, whispered about but never confirmed. The ghost of the Coruscant Highlands. Elena allowed herself a grim smile at the thought. She had been many things in her life. Soldier, sniper, protector, hunter, but she had never been a ghost before. There was something fitting about it, something that matched the person she had become. A person with no identity, no home, no future except the next mission. 3 hours later, she reached the cache site she had established on the southern slope of the mountain, a small cave hidden beneath an overhang of granite that was invisible from more than a few meters away. Inside, she had stored supplies, food, water, ammunition, a satellite phone that she used only for emergency communications. Elena activated the phone and waited for it to acquire a signal. The encryption protocols she used were military grade, routed through a series of proxy servers that would make any trace virtually impossible. When the connection stabilized, she composed a brief message. Contact negative. Belenko not present. Continuing south. Next check-in 72 hours. She sent the message to a dead drop account that was monitored by exactly one person, a former intelligence officer who had helped her disappear 3 years ago and who remained her only connection to a world she could never return to. Then she ate, forcing down calories she didn't want but her body desperately needed. Freeze-dried rations, energy bars, water melted from snow. Her hands were still stiff from the cold, her fingers slow to respond, but she forced herself to exercise them, squeezing and releasing until the blood flow returned. She would rest here for 6 hours, then continue south. The trail she had been following before the ambush incident suggested that Belenko was moving toward Kandahar, probably to meet with new clients or arrange another arms shipment. If she moved fast enough, she could intercept him before he disappeared again. But as she settled into her sleeping bag and closed her eyes, her thoughts drifted back to the valley, to the team leader scanning the ridge lines with binoculars that would never show him what he was looking for, to the wounded man on the litter, fighting for his life while his teammates carried him to safety, to the question she couldn't answer, even to herself. Why had she done it? The tactical calculation said she should have let them die. Every second she had spent engaging those snipers was a second she could have been tracking Belenko. Every shot she had fired was a signature that could be analyzed, traced, potentially connected to her presence in the region. She had compromised her mission for 6 strangers. 6 men she had never met and would never see again. The answer, when it came, was simpler than she expected, because they were soldiers, because they were serving their country, fighting the same enemies she had once fought, believing in the same ideals she had once believed in, because they deserved better than to die in a frozen valley thousands of miles from home, cut down by an ambush they never saw coming. Because once, 3 years ago, she had failed to protect the people who mattered most to her, and she would not fail again. Elena closed her eyes and let the exhaustion take her, falling into a dreamless sleep that lasted exactly 6 hours before her internal clock pulled her back to consciousness. When she woke, she was already moving, already planning, already hunting. Dmitry Belenko was still out there, and somewhere, a staff sergeant whose name she would never know was alive because she had chosen to pull the trigger. 3 weeks passed. In Kandahar, Staff Sergeant Derek Holloway returned to duty, leading his team through 2 more operations in the mountains of eastern Afghanistan. Kowalski was evacuated to Landstuhl Regional Medical Center in Germany, where surgeons rebuilt his leg with titanium plates and careful optimism. Webb got promoted. Chin got married over video call to his fiancée in San Diego. Reeves rotated back to Virginia Beach, his deployment complete. Life went on, the way it always does in war zones, where death walks hand in hand with mundane routine. But Holloway couldn't stop thinking about the mountain. He requested access to Project Winter Ridge, the investigation into the mysterious sniper who had saved his team. The request was denied. He filed a second request through different channels. Also denied. The third request earned him a personal visit from a colonel he had never met, who explained in polite but unmistakable terms that certain investigations were classified above his pay grade, and that his continued interest was noted but not appreciated. Holloway stopped asking, but he didn't stop wondering. At night, in his rack at the forward operating base, he would lie awake and replay the engagement in his mind. The crack of distant rifle fire, the impossible accuracy, the restrained violence of someone who killed only when necessary and spared when possible. A soldier's discipline, a warrior's code. Whoever the shooter was, they had operated alone, without support, without backup, in conditions that would have killed most people. They had watched the ambush develop, calculated the shots required, and executed with precision that defied comprehension. And then they had vanished, leaving nothing behind except 6 lives that should have ended in the snow. Holloway wrote letters to his wife, to his daughter, to his parents in Ohio. He didn't mention the sniper. Couldn't mention the sniper. But in every letter, there was an undertone of gratitude, a sense that something profound had changed in him. He had looked death in the face, and someone had pulled him back. On his last night in country, 3 months after the incident, Holloway climbed to the roof of the operations center and sat with his back against a sandbag wall, watching the stars emerge over the Hindu Kush. The mountains were beautiful in a harsh, unforgiving way. White peaks that had witnessed centuries of warfare, of empires rising and falling, of countless lives ending in anonymous valleys far from home. Somewhere out there, his ghost was still moving. He didn't know her name, Elena Vasquez, a name that would never appear in any file he could access, but he knew she existed. He knew she had chosen to save strangers when the easier choice would have been silence. He knew that somewhere in those mountains, someone was fighting a battle he couldn't understand, for reasons he would never learn. And he was grateful. Profoundly, irrevocably grateful. "Thank you," he said to the empty sky, the words barely a whisper. "Whoever you are, thank you." The mountains didn't answer. They never did. But somewhere, for 100 kilometers to the south, a woman with a rifle and a list of names looked up at the same stars and felt something shift inside her. Elena had tracked Belenko to a compound outside Kandahar, a walled estate that served as a meeting point for arms dealers and intelligence officers from 6 hostile nations. She had been watching the compound for 2 days, cataloging movements, identifying security protocols, waiting for her opportunity. Belenko was inside. She confirmed it 12 hours ago, when a convoy of armored vehicles had arrived and a man matching his description had stepped out, flanked by bodyguards in black tactical gear. 3 years of hunting, and her target was finally within reach. But as she lay in her hide position, scope trained on the compound's main entrance, she found herself thinking about the Coruscant Highlands, about the team leader who had been willing to die for his men, about the choice she had made, and the price she had paid. She had lost time, lost the opportunity to intercept Belenko before he reached Kandahar, lost weeks of intelligence gathering because she had stopped to save 6 strangers who meant nothing to her mission. Had it been worth it? Elena didn't know. She wasn't sure she ever would. But as she watched Belenko's compound through her scope, as she calculated distances and wind speeds in fields of fire, she felt something she hadn't felt in years. Peace. Not happiness. That was beyond her now, beyond the person she had become. But peace. The quiet certainty that whatever happened next, she had made a choice that mattered, that in a world of shadows and deception, she had done something pure. She had saved lives. Real lives. Men who would go home to families, who would hold their children, who would grow old in ways that Michael and David and Rebecca never would. That meant something. It had to mean something. Elena steadied her breathing and returned her attention to the compound. Belenko would die tonight. She had waited 3 years for this moment, tracked him across continents, sacrificed everything she had ever been. And when it was done, when his blood stained the Afghan dirt, she would disappear again. Another ghost, another legend. But this time, she wouldn't be running from the past. She would be walking towards something new. The shot came at 0347 local time, when Dmitry Belenko stepped onto the balcony of his compound to take a phone call that would never be completed. Elena watched through her scope as he raised the phone to his ear, his bodyguard standing 2 meters behind him, their eyes scanning the darkness without seeing the threat that waited 1,700 meters away. She had calculated this shot 100 times in her mind. Wind, 8 knots, steady. Temperature, -2 Celsius. Humidity, minimal. Her .338 Lapierre round would cover the distance in 1.7 seconds, entering through Belenko's left temple and exiting to the right side of the skull. It would be over before he knew it had begun. Elena's finger tightened on the trigger and stopped. Belenko wasn't alone on the balcony. Someone else had joined him, a woman in dark clothing, her face partially obscured by shadows. Elena adjusted her scope, bringing the second figure into focus. Her breath caught. The woman was wearing a collar, a metal band around her neck, connected to a chain that one of the bodyguards was holding. Her wrists were bound in front of her, and even from this distance, Elena could see the bruises on her face, the vacant look in her eyes. A prisoner, a slave. Belenko was gesturing at the woman while he spoke into his phone, laughing at something, his free hand reaching out to grip her jaw and turn her face toward the compound's lights. Even without audio, Elena could read his body language, the casual cruelty, the ownership, the absolute power of a man who had never faced consequences for anything he had done. Elena's blood ran cold. She knew what Belenko was. Arms dealer, intelligence broker, architect of operations that had cost countless lives. But she hadn't known about this, hadn't imagined that even he would sink to trafficking human beings like commodities. The smart play was to take the shot, end Belenko, complete the mission, disappear before security could react. The woman might be caught in the chaos, might die in the crossfire that would inevitably follow, but that wasn't Elena's responsibility. One life, one shot. 3 years of hunting, finally complete. But Elena couldn't pull the trigger. She watched through her scope as Belenko dismissed the woman with a wave, handing her chain to one of the bodyguards, who dragged her back inside the compound like an animal. The balcony door closed, and Belenko continued his phone call, oblivious to the crosshairs centered on his skull. Elena exhaled slowly. She had a decision to make. The smart play said take the shot. The mission said take the shot. Everything she had sacrificed, her career, her identity, her future, screamed at her to pull the trigger and end this. But she couldn't do it. Not while there was a prisoner inside that compound. Not while an innocent woman might die because Elena Vasquez had chosen vengeance over justice. She lowered her rifle and began planning something far more dangerous than an assassination, a rescue. 4 hours later, as the first light of dawn began to creep over the Hindu Kush, Elena infiltrated Belenko's compound through a drainage tunnel that hadn't been on any of the security assessments she had obtained. She moved like a shadow, her suppressed Sig Sauer P2-26 in hand, neutralizing guards with silent precision when necessary, avoiding detection entirely when possible. The compound was smaller than it looked from the outside, 20 rooms, maybe 30, spread across 2 floors of building that had once been a wealthy merchant's estate. The prisoners, there were 7 of them, she discovered, not just one, were being held in a basement that had been converted into cells. Iron bars, concrete walls, a single guard who died without making a sound when Elena's blade found his throat. The woman from the balcony was among them. Her name was Amira, and she had been taken from her village in Helmand province 6 months ago. She was 19 years old. Elena released them all, provided directions to the nearest American patrol route, and watched them disappear into the pre-dawn darkness before she turned her attention back to her original target. Belenko was in his bedroom on the 2nd floor, sleeping off the previous night's excesses. Elena reached his door at 0523, picked the lock in 3 seconds, and entered the room where her enemy lay dreaming. He woke to find her sitting in a chair beside his bed, her rifle across her lap, her eyes meeting his with an expression that had no room for mercy. "Do you know who I am?" she asked quietly. Belenko's face cycled through confusion, fear, and finally recognition. His eyes widened. "Vasquez. Elena Vasquez." His voice was thick with sleep and dawning terror. "I thought you were dead. A lot of people thought that." Elena leaned forward. "Colonel Hartwell thought that, right up until I put a round through his eye socket 2 years ago. Your friends in Moscow thought that, until I started eliminating them one by one. And now it's your turn. Whatever you want, money, information, I can give you anything." "I want 3 names," Elena said, cutting him off. "Michael Torres, David Kim, Rebecca Chun. Do you remember them?" Belenko's face went pale. "That wasn't. I didn't. They were my people, my family, and you helped Hartwell kill them." Elena's finger moved to the trigger of her rifle. "But before I end this, I want you to understand something. I'm not here because of what you did to me. I'm not here for revenge." She stood, towering over the man who had caused so much suffering, and saw nothing but fear in his eyes. "I'm here because of the people you're still hurting. The slaves in your basement, the weapons you're selling, the wars you're feeding. You're a parasite, Belenko, and parasites need to be removed." The shot was almost gentle, a single round that ended 3 years of hunting in less than a second. Elena collected her brass, wiped down every surface she had touched, and disappeared to the same drainage tunnel she had used to enter. By the time Belenko's bodyguards found his body, she was 10 kilometers away, walking south toward a new life she hadn't imagined until this moment. 6 months later, Derek Holloway stood on the beach at Virginia Beach, watching his daughter build a sandcastle while his wife read a book in a folding chair nearby. The sun was warm on his face, and the salt air smelled like home. He had retired from the Navy 2 months ago, after 20 years of service that had taken him to every corner of the world. He had medals, Bronze Stars, Purple Hearts, commendations from generals and admirals whose names would never be known to the public. But the medal that meant the most to him was the one that didn't exist. The day he should have died and didn't. Project Winter Ridge had never reached a conclusion. The investigation had been classified and archived, its findings or lack thereof, sealed behind security protocols that no one seemed willing to challenge. The official record simply noted that Holloway's team had been extracted from a hostile situation with assistance from unknown friendly forces. Unknown friendly forces. That was one way to put it. Holloway's phone buzzed with a text message. He glanced at the screen, expecting his brother-in-law asking about dinner plans. Instead, he saw a single sentence from a number he didn't recognize. "Your daughter has your eyes. Stay safe, Staff Sergeant." Holloway's heart stopped. He looked up from his phone, scanning the beach, the boardwalk, the parking lot beyond. Families playing in the surf. Joggers running along the sand. Nothing out of place. Nothing unusual. Nothing except the sense that someone was watching him from very far away. His phone buzzed again. "Don't look for me. You won't find anything. But know this, what you did on that mountain, the choice you made, IT mattered. Some debts can't be repaid. They can only be honored." Holloway read the message 3 times, feeling the weight of every word. Then he typed a response. "Who are you?" The reply came immediately. "A friend." Nothing more. Then the number disconnected, and when Holloway tried to call it back, he got a recording saying the number was not in service. He stood there for a long moment, phone in hand, staring at the ocean that stretched toward a horizon he couldn't see. Somewhere out there, a ghost was still moving, a soldier without a country, fighting battles that would never make the news, saving lives that would never know her name. She had given him back everything, his family, his future, his chance to grow old, and asked for nothing in return. He didn't know her name. He would never know her story. But he knew one thing with absolute certainty. She was still out there, still watching, still protecting the people who couldn't protect themselves. Holloway put his phone away and walked back to his daughter's sandcastle. Sophia looked up at him with a smile that contained all the joy in the world. "Daddy, look, I made a tower. It's beautiful, sweetheart." He knelt beside her, helping her pack sand into the bucket. "You know what? Let's make it even bigger. Behind them, the sun began its slow descent toward the water, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold. The waves rolled in and out, eternal and patient, carrying with them the stories of everyone who had ever walked the shore. And 3,000 miles away, on a mountainside that overlooked a valley where no one had died when they should have, Elena Vasquez lowered her binoculars and allowed herself a small, private smile. She had been watching Holloway for 3 days. Not because she had to, but because she wanted to see the man she had saved, living the life she had given him. His daughter really did have his eyes. His wife really did love him. His future really was everything she had hoped it would be. It was enough. It had to be enough. Elena packed her gear, policed a position until no evidence remained, and began walking south toward her next mission. The wind was gentle here, nothing like the howling blizzards of the Coruscant Highlands, and the temperature was warm enough that she didn't need her cold weather gear. She thought about the 3 names she had avenged. Michael Torres, David Kim, Rebecca Chun. They were gone, but they weren't forgotten. They lived in her memory, in the choices she made, in the lives she saved, because she had learned what it meant to protect the people who mattered. She thought about Colonel Hartwell, whose grave she would never visit, and Dmitry Belenko, whose empire had crumbled after his death. She thought about the 7 women she had freed from his compound, now scattered across the world, living lives that had been stolen from them and then returned. She thought about all of it, and she felt something she hadn't felt in a very long time. Hope. The world was broken. It would always be broken. There would always be men like Hartwell and Belenko, predators who fed on the weak and the innocent. But there would also always be people like Derek Holloway, willing to sacrifice everything for the ones they loved. And there would always be ghosts like her, watching from the shadows, taking the shots that no one else could take. Elena Vasquez walked south, toward a sunrise that painted the mountains in shades of gold and crimson, and she knew that whatever came next, she was ready for it. The mission continued. It always would.